Despite talk of peace, 2026 is off to a bloody start. From Ukraine to Gaza, from Sudan to Venezuela, war and war crimes have been in the news. Why does this seem to be an age of atrocity? Why should we care? And what can be done about it? Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, former Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law and President of the American branch of the International Law Association. To answer these questions, I'm going to be engaging in a fireside chat with the former Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, Beth Van Schaack. Beth is in town to deliver the Klatsky Distinguished Lecture and receive Case Western Reserve's Humanitarian Award for Advancing Global Justice, sometimes called Cleveland's Nobel. Welcome to Cleveland.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. Such an honor. Thank you for having me.
So let's kick things off by talking about your background. Did you always want to be a war crimes expert?
So not necessarily. In my younger years, I gravitated more towards science, and in college, I think I was leaning towards public health. But then I spent a year in East Africa right after graduation and worked a lot on women's issues and became very enamored with the idea of human rights and how rights could advance the well-being of people in poverty, people who were marginalized. And so I pivoted and went to law school, and there I focused almost all of my attention on international justice issues.
All right. And you are a graduate of Stanford University, Yale Law School, and you received your PhD a couple of years later at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Earlier in your career, you were a prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. How did that come about?
Well, so I was at law school at a time when international law felt like it was being revived. It was a renaissance. We had the Security Council working, the Cold War had ended, we had the two tribunals that were established for the former Yugoslavia and then for the genocide that happened in Rwanda. So the promise of Nuremberg was being revived, and that felt like a really exciting time. So somebody came and gave a talk at my law school. He was a prosecutor that had been hired very early on, and I always tell this story to students because I was fascinated by what he talked about. He was talking about all of these blue sky legal issues that had to be decided. How do you do conflict classification? How do you think about the crime of genocide? While he was literally unpacking the desk that he was working on because the tribunal had just been established. And I thought, that just sounds amazing. So when I graduated, I reached out to this person and I said, hey, I would love to come and work with you. How do we make that happen? And so that was my first job out of law school.
So what was your work like at the tribunals? What were your most important cases that you worked on?
Well, I was fortunate in that I worked on the Tadic case, which you know well, Michael, having written a book about it. This was really the first major case to come to the Yugoslavia Tribunal and go all the way through an appellate process. And for the lawyers out there listening, this is very much the Marbury versus Madison of international criminal justice. All of the big issues had to be dealt with, including the very legality of the tribunal having been established by the Security Council. So there were so many meaty legal issues we got to work on. I also worked on the Blaskic case, which was the first case to really adjudicate superior responsibility. How do you hold someone up the chain of command responsible for the depredations of their subordinates? But then there were a lot of kind of quotidian things like handwriting analysis. Can you introduce handwriting analysis in international law? Who knew? So we had to look at this comparative approach and figure out how the systems of the world dealt with handwriting analysis. So a lot of these really new issues that we got to chew on. And I was working with, I was sort of a human rights person, but I was working with really excellent criminal law lawyers who had come to the tribunal and then military law lawyers. And we had to sort of work together and figure out how to do this new institution and how to make it work.
All right. And then you went from there to serving as deputy to Stephen Rapp, the ambassador at large for global criminal justice at the State Department during the Obama administration. And then President Biden nominated you in 2022 to take over as the ambassador. Now, as I recall at the time, the Senate was divided 51 Democrats to 49 Republicans. What was your confirmation process like under those conditions?
So it was maybe easier than you might think. The portfolio that I managed at the State Department, the Global Justice portfolio, actually has historically really enjoyed bipartisan support. So I felt like I had good allies on both sides of the aisle. It's still an incredibly grueling process. It was almost a year from when I was announced as being the candidate to when I finally took over the position. Went through many, many interviews, had to have a whole hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, got grilled with questions there. Although, again, it wasn't as awful as it might might have been had there been hostility towards either me or towards the work. And then ultimately, there was a waiting period where my nomination didn't move, and it was frustrating. My life was essentially on hold. And then I started to hear kind of rumors that maybe I would be confirmed. Meanwhile, Russia had invaded Ukraine. And there was a huge sort of uproar that we didn't have someone leading the Office of Global Justice at a time when we had an international armed conflict in Europe. And so I was watching C-SPAN and actually making dinner, and they recessed, and I thought, oh, again, another day, I'm not confirmed. And then my phone blew up, and I realized I'd missed the vote somehow. So I'd been confirmed, and so I was on a plane the next day in Washington.
I guess it's true. Timing is everything.
Timing is everything.
So what were your responsibilities like in that office? What were you responsible for? What were you in charge of?
So this position was the brainchild of Madeleine Albright when she was Secretary of State, and she wanted there to be a senior Senate-confirmed individual reporting directly to the Secretary to help her think about how the U.S. could support global justice efforts. So that role continued. I advised Secretary Blinken and other senior officials around the interagency on a whole range of preventative measures, how to mitigate atrocities, and then what to do after the fact when it came to justice. I looked for ways to launch or to widen various pathways for justice around the world. I would often advise our ambassadors and our embassies and our posts out there in the field if, for example, a country that they were in was hosting a truth commission or was considering an amnesty. I would go and explain what the legal limitations are, what the options are, how we could support, if it was a genuine effort, how we could support that effort. And I worked often with civil society organizations, with survivor organizations. I had a terrific team, and I had a small budget that I could deploy in this regard. So I tried to fund good projects around the world.
Now, you mentioned that when you started in this position, Russia had just invaded Ukraine. And then shortly after that, there was the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Tell us about your major challenges and accomplishments during this really crazy time.
Well, after the full-scale Russian invasion, there was a lot of U.S. support, bipartisan and all the political branches everywhere for justice. And so I had a pretty steady green light. Pretty much anything I wanted to do, Secretary Blinken said, go, yes, do it. Get us behind that. So we engaged in a number of different justice efforts, including starting to think about what an aggression tribunal would look like, funding cases that might go with universal jurisdiction, helping the Ukrainians, as I know you have done through the Cox Center at the law school, but helping the Ukrainians think about how to do good and fair war crimes cases in their own system. We pulled together the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group with the European Union and the United Kingdom to surge expertise into Ukraine. It was pretty much, as I said, a green light. This portfolio became more difficult after the events of October 7th. Justice was not a priority for the U.S. government necessarily, and so it took a lot of managing the process internally to try and ensure that we took a more open-minded approach to justice. And, I know we'll probably get to this later in the conversation, but there was a lot of hostility for the ICC prosecutor moving forward in that matter. And in many respects, other elements of my portfolio suffered because I couldn't be out there promoting Sudan unabashed, full-throated for justice, because the next question would be, well, why aren't you promoting justice for what's happening in Gaza? And that what about question would constantly stymie me because I didn't have a great answer for that. So that was a really challenging time, trying to balance what my own government was doing, but also still continue to push these issues in all the other places around the world.
And with an election coming up, that was a really thorny issue.
Very thorny issue.
So let's go back to Ukraine. The International Criminal Court, which you referred to as the ICC, it issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin, charging him with ordering and kidnapping Ukrainian children from areas of occupation, based in part on evidence that the United States provided. With all the war crimes that Russia has committed in Ukraine, why would you say that the ICC decided to focus on child kidnapping?
Well, I can't speak for the Office of the Prosecutor, obviously, but it is a pretty horrific set of facts, right? Abducting Ukrainian children, subjecting them to militaristic training, forcing them not to speak their native language, implying that Ukraine doesn't exist as a country, that it's a fantasy, and that they all should be Russian, pretending that their parents had abandoned them, and that's why that they were never picked up from summer camp, for example. So there's also really solid evidence that that program goes all the way up to the highest of levels, including evidence that came from the defendants' mouths themselves. So I think for many prosecutors, they're thinking about how they can allocate scarce resources. And this is not an easy case, but it's maybe an easier case than some of the conduct of hostilities issues where you have the fog of war, maybe complicating matters. Speculation here. Abducting children is also one of the ways in which genocide can be committed. And so one wonders whether they might have been thinking about, let's pursue this line of inquiry, and if we get to the point where we feel confident that this was being done with the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part, perhaps there's a superseding indictment that emerges.
I think it's certainly the type of case that really pulls at your heartstrings.
Yes.
So the ICC then issued a second arrest warrant, this time charging Putin's top generals and admirals with ordering the indiscriminate bombing of Ukraine's civilian objects. Now, I've been, as you mentioned, helping to train Ukrainian prosecutors to prosecute Russian war crimes against Ukraine's environment. And I wonder, do you think that the International Criminal Court will end up issuing a third set of charges for the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam and other environmental war crimes that have been in the news?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I know a lot of non-governmental organizations and advocates have shared evidence that they have pulled together with the Office of the Prosecutor in an effort to encourage them to think about bringing environmental crimes cases. Ukraine, in their own domestic proceedings, as you know, have been very much in the lead here. They have ecocide in their penal code, one of the few states that was really at the early end of incorporating that crime into their code. Now, the Kakhovka Dam is an interesting case, and I can't get into the details, but it's maybe not as slam dunk a case as you might think. It's a little more complicated. And so remains to be seen whether that would be the first case that they would bring, notwithstanding how devastating the destruction of that dam was to the local environment. But I'm very hopeful that the Ukraine matter will really bring to the surface the importance of prosecuting these crimes alongside crimes against the human person, custodial crimes, means and methods of warfare, etc.
And you mentioned the crime of aggression, which is basically launching an aggressive war without any justification. The International Criminal Court currently cannot prosecute Russia for that crime. Why did the United States initially support the idea of prosecuting Russia for the crime of aggression and then end up opposing the UN's establishment of a tribunal for that case?
Well, the Ukrainians from the beginning insisted that the crime of aggression should be prosecuted here. They see that as the font of all of the other atrocities, and the United States agrees with that. It's very clear from the evidentiary record. And this is a crime that really hasn't been prosecuted since the World War II era. It was invented at that time, and it was almost the centerpiece of the Nuremberg indictment and the indictment at Tokyo as well. And to be clear, we always supported the assignment of individual criminal responsibility for the crime of aggression. I was the person that made that announcement. I was really proud that our government got behind that initiative and supported our Ukrainian colleagues in that regard. Where things differed was in the modalities. And so, as you mentioned, one of the proposals that was put forward was a General Assembly-backed tribunal. And the previous ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and for Rwanda had been created by the Security Council, which has executive power under the UN Charter system. But of course, Russia would have vetoed any such effort. So that was the encouragement to look to the General Assembly. We had both legal concerns and kind of more pragmatic concerns. The legal concerns were, under the Charter, does the General Assembly have the power to create a coercive mechanism that would literally take people into custody and potentially order them to serve a sentence for the rest of their life, when the Charter only gives the General Assembly the power to make recommendations to states, and then states can decide whether to implement those. So that was a legal concern. On a practical level, honestly, we were not sure we had the votes in the General Assembly for such an exercise. If you look at the voting patterns, when we're condemning Russian atrocities, we got about 140 votes, which is a good number out of 194 UN member states. When we tried to kick, and we ultimately did, kick Russia off the Human Rights Council, we only got 90 positive votes. So doing something that seemed so obvious could only garner 90 votes. So then asking the General Assembly to create a new, untested, potentially legally infirm institution, we were really concerned we wouldn't have the votes. So we put forward a model of more of a hybrid court that would be created with international community's assistance, but ultimately grounded in Ukraine's domestic system. And that's ultimately where we landed.
And so the European countries have now stepped in to fill the void by working with Ukraine to create this hybrid court that you mentioned. Tell us about that initiative. Where does it stand?
So there were monthly negotiation sessions, and a very senior lawyer in my office participated actively in those, along with the legal advisor's office. It's created under the auspices of the Council of Europe, which is a group of European states broader than the European Union. It will be based at first in outside of Ukraine, but could potentially be transferred into Ukraine if and when the security conditions allow. It will have jurisdiction over those most responsible for designing and implementing the war of aggression in Ukraine. And it can be staffed by individuals from around the world. I had some funding that I was going to put towards this tribunal. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has completely pulled out of this process and is no longer participating, so I don't envision us playing a direct role. In the meantime, we also created what's called the International Center for the Prosecution of Aggression. This is sort of a proto-prosecutorial office in The Hague, and we were able to second a very senior DOJ lawyer to serve there as our representative, and my office was able to help fund that. She, unfortunately, has also been recalled. But that group was able to put together, I imagine, notional indictments, and those will eventually serve as the basis for prosecutions before the new tribunal.
Now, you did mention that it would prosecute those most responsible, but I have heard that the new tribunal cannot prosecute Russian President Vladimir Putin or Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov because the drafters decided to include a provision granting them immunity, at least while they're still in office. What's your opinion about that?
So, like it or not, head of state immunity is very deeply established within international law. And it wasn't just the United States. All of the G7 were concerned about imagining a tribunal that might have jurisdiction over a sitting head of state. And so this became somewhat of an impasse in the negotiations. And eventually, what I think is a very elegant solution was arrived upon, which is that the prosecutor's office can do all of the investigative work and can even pull together an indictment against a sitting head of state or one of the so-called troika, head of state, head of government, and foreign ministers. They're all entitled to this so-called head of state immunity. But then the proceedings would go into suspension while they are still in position. Meanwhile, the prosecutor could then prosecute more mid-level or other senior personnel who don't benefit from head of state immunity, potentially flip some individuals, have some individuals turn state's witness, do what's taken to lay the groundwork, and then as soon as Putin and Lavrov are no longer in their positions, then they're vulnerable to prosecution. And all of us in this field know that we're playing a long game, that things can turn very quickly. I mean, just think about Syria, right? The House of Assad controlled that country for decades. And the next thing we know, Bashar al-Assad is gone. Likewise, in Sudan, we saw this with the dictator who had been indicted by the International Criminal Court, suddenly thrown out of office. So, one never knows, and one can always hope, and we're all playing a long game.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Now, Beth, in November 2024, while you were ambassador, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Yoav Gallant, the former Israeli Minister of Defense. What are your thoughts about that?
So, as you can imagine, this was very contentious internally. Israel is a very close ally, and they have a number of strong relationships around the U.S. government. And so our reaction formally as a government was very hostile to those actions. If you remember, the president came out pretty strongly against them. It was very contentious, right? Serious and tragic events happened following October 7th. First, a massive attack on the Israeli population that may have risen itself to the level of genocide. And then you have Israel responding in really systemic ways where charges of starvation as a weapon of war, even genocide, have been leveled against their reaction to the events of October 7th. And so, in the end, the United States government didn't support the pursuit of justice before the ICC necessarily. I saw my job as trying to mitigate some of the more harsh responses to that. In the end, I think we should be supportive of justice in that situation because horrific crimes have been committed and we shouldn't have a system necessarily of selective justice. So the ICC will proceed as they see fit with respect to those indictments. The three individuals on the Hamas side have all been killed in battle. And so now it feels very one-sided because we only have the 2 Israeli defendants still subject to arrest warrants. As far as we know, there may be additional warrants that are now under seal.
But is this all symbolic? I mean, what are the prospects of Putin or Netanyahu ever being tried by the International Criminal Court?
Well, like I mentioned, I mean, many people would have thought, what are the prospects of a dictator in Syria ever being prosecuted? And now he's on the run, right? Of course, he's been given safe haven in Russia, but again, that may change as well. So, looking at the political situation within Israel, I think Netanyahu is also deeply unpopular. Who knows how long he will remain in office? He's been subject to investigation and prosecution for acts of alleged corruption in his own system. So, let's see. The ICC is a court of last resort. And so if Israel in the end does decide to prosecute him themselves, then that may divest the court of jurisdiction and they would allow the national system to proceed. If they don't proceed against him on the basis of international crimes, but only the corruption charges, then there might be some situation of concurrent jurisdiction. But as you note, if they start to travel, will states be willing to ultimately turn them over? And we've already seen both of them, both Putin and Netanyahu, travel to ICC member states, and they were not extradited to The Hague. So,
and we've also seen Putin try to travel to South Africa for the BRICS conference.
And it was thwarted. So, indeed, their spheres of operation are significantly narrowed by virtue of those arrest warrants.
Well, it's time for a short break. We've been talking about war crimes with the former U.S. Ambassador for Global Criminal Justice, Beth Van Schaack. When we return, we're going to be talking about the future of international criminal justice in light of recent events. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, the president of the American branch of the International Law Association and the former dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Today, I'm talking about war crimes with the former U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, Beth Van Schaack. Beth, one of the first things Donald Trump did when he became president last year was to close down your old office and terminate the ambassador at large position. Why do you think he did that? And what are the consequences for U.S. foreign policy?
Well, sadly, this was a part of a much larger, in fact, massive downsizing and restructuring of the entire foreign policy apparatus within the U.S. government. This saw the elimination of USAID, the Agency for International Development, and the hollowing out of the diplomatic corps. All of the human rights functional offices were either eliminated or depopulated or de-resourced or significantly downgraded. And so all of that work is basically gone now. The regional bureaus have remained largely in place. When Secretary Rubio has been pressed on why he would get rid of an office like mine, which, as I mentioned earlier, has enjoyed bipartisan support since its inception, his answer is that the functionalities, quote unquote, of the office are going to be carried out by the legal advisor's office. But that's not a policy shop. Those are lawyers who worry about legal red lines. As a policy shop, the Office of Global Criminal Justice would do things like go to Cox's Bazar, which is one of the largest refugee camps in the world in Bangladesh. And I would sit on the floor with survivors and hear from them what their vision of justice is. I would be pounding the pavement looking for funding to fund reparations for survivors. I would travel to places like Liberia or the Central African Republic and speak with members of the Bar Association there and help them conceptualize what justice might look like for those societies following horrific atrocities. No one from the legal advisor's office is going to do that. That's just not in their job description. So that is what is lost when you close these offices. And maybe most pressingly, Secretary Rubio just announced a sort of sketch of a plan for Venezuela, and phase 3 is supposed to involve a transition and reconciliation. And ordinarily, that's exactly where my office would be working. We would be working on those transitional justice concepts to deal with the horrific violence that the Venezuelans have experienced under Maduro, to make sure that's addressed, whether through a truth commission or through reparations or through some sort of criminal justice process. Who's going to do that? Who's going to do that phase 3 without an office like mine? It remains to be seen.
And closing down your old office was not all that President Trump did. He also issued an executive order placing sanctions on prosecutors and judges of the International Criminal Court who were involved in the Afghanistan and Gaza cases. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, needless to say, the sanctions are entirely inappropriate. They're inappropriate from a legal perspective, from a moral perspective, and then even just from a practical perspective. So these are authorities, legal authorities, that we ordinarily use for like drug kingpins or for terrorists. And to suddenly now use them against international civil servants who are working within an international organization that has been joined by 120 plus states, all of our closest allies are supporters of the court, to deliver justice in the face of atrocities, it's a completely inappropriate use of those authorities. It's catastrophic for the individuals involved who can't use a credit card, right? They have to carry cash around because they're closed out of the international banking system. It's also threatening the prospects of justice across the tribunal because civil society organizations, even survivors, victims, are afraid to interact with the court because our enforcement mechanism is so strong that any possible support to the individuals who are sanctioned, who are assigned to multiple portfolios, could put you in the sights of U.S. enforcement authorities. So it's going to be impacting cases in Darfur, Myanmar, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Libya, which has a new defendant in custody. But they're also just ineffectual, right? Like the court can't be seen to be caving to the United States. And so it's not going to change course. They're going to follow the evidence where it leads. And we should be supportive of justice in all of these matters. And it's going to cause many of our allies to circle the wagons to defend the court. They're very committed to the court. They're committed to its success. Maybe their response is not as robust as we might want, but the point is it's going to isolate us diplomatically. And it's also, I should say, unnecessary. The current prosecutor has already announced that he's not proceeding against international forces in the Afghanistan matter. He's focusing only on Taliban. And in fact, they've just issued a really groundbreaking arrest warrant for senior Taliban figures for gender persecution that includes persecution against people who are gender nonconforming. So that's the first ever done. This is an incredibly important event. And so should we be attacking an institution that is going to be setting new precedent in defense of women and girls who just want to play out their life plans as they see fit? So I'm really hopeful that they'll stop at the current number of sanctions and actually think about dismantling the sanctions over time.
Well, let me try to put this in the big picture. While the Democratic administrations have been supportive of the International Criminal Court, the Republican administrations have been trying to frustrate its work since its very founding. When George Bush signed the American Service Members Protection Act, sometimes referred to as the Hague Invasion Act, I mean, that was an attack on the court. Do you think the United States can better protect its interest as a hostile outsider or an influential insider?
So I think it's a combination of the two, in the sense that I think what we should be is a helpful or constructive outsider. I think it's unlikely that we would ratify the Rome Statute, which is the treaty that created the ICC, anytime soon, in part because it's almost impossible for us to ratify treaties these days. Even the Law of the Sea Treaty, which has incredible national security benefits to the United States, we can't get that through Congress, through the Senate. So, we're not going to ratify. But I have learned in the two roles that I have occupied that there's a lot that the United States can do to support the court when it comes to information sharing, diplomatic support, expertise, security issues with the cyber attacks that the court has experienced, and an individual who was posing as a Brazilian intern that was actually a Russian agent who's now being prosecuted by the United States. So this is the kind of support we can provide to this institution. And most of the situations in which the court is working in is entirely consistent with U.S. foreign policy towards those institutions. Justice has been a component of our policy towards those situations. And so we found ways as we can to support the court in all of these other situations. And so even the American Service Members Protection Act, elements of that statute have been taken down or have been declawed. And actually, there's a really important clause within there called the Dodd Amendment, because Chris Dodd, when he was a member of Congress, insisted on its inclusion, that says, sort of notwithstanding all of this other stuff, The United States can assist efforts to prosecute individuals who stand accused of the worst international crimes. And that is the opening that allowed my office to channel support to the International Criminal Court. So again, it's an institution, it exists, it's part of the firmament of international organizations. We may disagree with certain decisions that principles of the ICC make, just like we disagree with other decisions that international organizations make. But it's part of the cost of being part of an international community, and we should address those diplomatically rather than using these completely inappropriate sanctions authorities.
It does seem that over the last 2 decades, the fledgling ICC has sort of found itself. So it now has 125 state parties. It has issued 73 arrest warrants in 17 different situations. It's completed 17 trials. And the former president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, is now in custody awaiting trial for crimes against humanity. So would you say that the ICC has been a success or a failure or a mixed bag?
So you put your finger on my answer. My answer is always it's a mixed bag. So as you say, it's in some respects, it feels like it's hitting its stride. And there have been some incredible examples of international cooperation and really groundbreaking jurisprudence. The first Darfur case, for example, Duterte in custody, as you mentioned. There's a new Libyan who's a kind of a prison boss who's just brought into custody, was found in Europe. On the other hand, attacks are escalating. We have the U.S. sanctions, but also Russia has been attacking the court, including, we presume, cyber attacks. And Israel has also been very aggressive against the ICC. We've seen a lack of cooperation, as we mentioned, with respect to some travel of individuals subject to indictments. And then Italy released another Libyan defendant that was in its custody for reasons that are inexplicable, although probably have to do with the fact that Italy is very dependent on Libya to prevent migrants from coming to Italian shores. The fact that elements of the court remain weak are not really the fault of the court. It was designed that way. It was designed to depend upon state cooperation. So if it's not functioning well, it's because states are not carrying out their roles within the Rome Statute system. And so we have to urge states to step up and support the institution that they created and that they voluntarily joined. There's also some own goals, honestly. There have been some very poorly reasoned decisions. I'm thinking in particular about a case that came out of Mali where an al-Qaeda-affiliated individual was found guilty of religious persecution but acquitted on gender persecution grounds with a duress defense. I mean, it's literally inexplicable, the decision-making on there, and it really calls into question the sort of quality of the legal reasoning. And there's still serious concerns about workplace culture. The prosecutor stands accused of committing sexual assault, not just sexual harassment, but sexual assault. And frankly, the institution has not dealt with those allegations well. It's been months now, and we still don't have a final decision. So there's a lot of work to do. But ultimately, I will say in the whole timeline of international relations and the establishment of the United Nations, it's still early days. And we all just need to remain committed to strengthening these institutions and to move us towards a globe that is governed by the rule of law and not the rule of force.
So just a couple of days ago, another one of these draft peace agreements between Russia, the United States, and Ukraine was released. And point 26 of the 30-point plan says that the parties will provide amnesty for war crimes. Do you think an amnesty for peace swap in Ukraine is a good idea?
Well, at some level, this is for the Ukrainians to decide for themselves if they want to relinquish the right to pursue justice here. But I would caution that while often tempting as an expedient solution to try and get a peace deal in place, over the years, what we have seen is that amnesties just don't hold. They're often declared unconstitutional by the national system, or they may be declared in contravention to states' international human rights obligations. And of course, Ukraine is subject to the European Court of Human Rights, and so inevitably there will be a challenge to any sort of an amnesty law. And international law is pretty clear that amnesties are acceptable if it's just for participating in conflict. We want armed groups to lay down their arms and to come back into society. But if individuals stand accused of committing international crimes, an amnesty is not appropriate. Colombia is experimenting with a kind of conditional amnesty, and it remains to be seen if that will hold sway. But many other pathways to justice would not have to respect or enforce that amnesty. So the ICC would be under no obligation to enforce that amnesty. They could proceed with their cases, and likewise cases that might proceed in courts around the world under principles of extraterritorial jurisdiction, including a case we have filed here in the United States. So again, it may be tempting, but I'm not sure it's going to do the job, or I'm not sure it can be relied upon.
Speaking of the International Criminal Court, there is an article in its statute, Article 16, that says that if the Security Council wants to, it can vote. Of course, it's subject to the veto, but it can vote to shut down ICC prosecutions in the interests of justice. Do you think there would be any prospect for the Security Council to take that kind of action related to Ukraine if it was part of an overall peace arrangement?
It's extremely interesting to think through, and it often will depend, I think, on who are the non-permanent members of the council when that decision comes forward. Because you need 9 concurring votes, plus no veto by any member of the permanent 5. So, of course, Russia would support that. China probably would fall in line as well. The Trump administration might support that. I don't think the Biden-Harris administration would have. So then the question is, would France or the UK be willing to go along, or would they exercise their veto in that regard? And then could you get another 4 or more potentially concurring votes? And just looking at the current makeup, there's a couple of European states on the Security Council. They would probably not accept that and may not be able to by virtue of what they see as their fealty to the ICC. But then we have, the DRC, Pakistan, Somalia, it may be a matter of pressure on those states to kind of go along. The important thing about Article 16 is it doesn't cancel the prosecution altogether. It just delays it for a year that could be renewable. So this may be the kind of situation that Article 16 was designed to deal with, to just give some breathing room for the parties to turn what might be a sort of fragile ceasefire into a more permanent situation of peace, even if it means fragile peace.
Yeah. Well, since January 3rd, everybody's been talking about Venezuela. So let's talk about that. It started with U.S. airstrikes against Venezuelan vessels, including follow-up strikes to kill survivors. And then it escalated to U.S. seizure of Venezuelan oil tankers, and then it culminated in a military operation that resulted in the capture of Venezuela's president and the First Lady. In your expert opinion, were any of those war crimes?
So my answer may be somewhat paradoxical, but I'm going to say a tentative no. But this is why. It's not to say they're not unlawful. Much of that is conduct that you described is unlawful under international law and potentially under domestic law. But in order to charge war crimes, the primary predicate is the existence of an armed conflict. And so if we look at the situation in Venezuela as 2 phases, phase 1 was Operation Southern Spear, which is this attack on these ships arguably bringing drugs into the United States, although the facts there are somewhat uncertain. That is not an armed conflict. That is a sort of asymmetrical use of violence. There isn't an organized armed group. There isn't an exchange of fire. We can't just call it an armed conflict and say that we can use the same authorities that we could use in an armed conflict and just describe these people as combatants if they're not in fact combatants and there isn't an armed conflict. Now, it's not to say it's not lawful, as I mentioned. Domestic law bears on this and international law. So ultimately, these feel like extrajudicial killings under international human rights law. In addition, international law has something to say about widespread or systematic attacks against civilians, individuals who are not combatants. And that can rise to the level of crimes against humanity. So this could be a campaign of crimes against humanity under international law. So that's the first phase. Then when you turn to the Maduro capture phase, Operation Absolute Resolve, then we really are in a conflict situation. We initiated an international armed conflict with Venezuela when we invaded the country in order to snatch their leader. That in and of itself is not necessarily a war crime. It's not a violation of the laws of war. It is a violation of the UN Charter. It is a violation of public international law. It is a violation of the sovereignty of Venezuela, but it's not necessarily a war crime per se. Then you have to look more broadly. Were civilians killed? Was disproportionate force used? And honestly, I don't know the facts well enough. My understanding is that a number of the casualties were sort of Cuban mercenaries who were in a combatant status. And so that is the essence of war, is that you can kill the combatants. And so that would not necessarily at first blush be a war crime.
All right, so you said they might be international law violations, even if they're not war crimes. President Trump stated on January 20th of last year that drug cartels are foreign terrorist organizations. And then in October of this last year, he announced that the United States was in a non-international armed conflict with the drug cartels. Then on December 15th last year, he declared that fentanyl trafficked into the United States was actually a weapon of mass destruction. What do these declarations mean for domestic law and international law? Are these justifications that should be accepted?
Well, I think we should parse them carefully because some of them are internally contradictory if you read them carefully, particularly when the Trump administration is trying to fit itself within domestic law and then also within international law. So on the one hand, when responding to claims that the strikes run counter to U.S. law because Congress wasn't officially informed, et cetera, they argue that there's no armed conflict, so it doesn't trigger the War Powers Resolution and no need to engage conflict. Then, as you said, they say, oh, well, we could kill these guys because they're combatants and we're in a non-international armed conflict with drug cartels. So that implies that actually there are hostilities and there should have been some congressional protection or notification and all of the procedural protections of the War Crimes Resolution would kick in. Then we now have truly an international armed conflict with Venezuela. Domestically, when we were trying to deport Venezuelans en masse, we tried to do so under the Alien Enemies Act and argued that Tren de Aragua, the cartel, was linked to the Venezuelan government because you have to have state action to use the Enemies Alien Act. But then when we're talking about the strikes in the sea, we're talking about non-state actors, and so it's a non-international armed conflict. So, we have to look at the facts as we can prove them on our own and as journalists will prove and as advocates will prove, rather than the labels that get applied in order to try and fit the course of conduct into these various legal frameworks.
I guess they would say consistency is the hobgoblin of a narrow mind, but I see where you're going with all of that. Let me ask a specific question. Does international law permit countries to abduct foreign leaders like Manuel Noriega of Panama or Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela when they are charged with crimes in their courts?
So the short answer is no, and it's both domestic and international law. So under domestic law, we don't have any kind of authorization to use force in Venezuela. As I mentioned, we now have an international armed conflict, nor do we have Article 2 presidential powers. There are circumstances in which the president can act unilaterally without going to Congress, but it's normally in a situation of an extreme risk or threat to the United States, and we just don't have that here. Obviously, we have often run afoul of the War Powers Resolution, so this is not the first administration to do so, but we really have a full-scale invasion here, and that there are certain domestic law requirements. Under international law, this is clearly a breach of Venezuelan sovereignty and of the UN Charter. There's no plausible self-defense argument here. There wasn't an armed attack against us. Your point about the so-called weapons of mass destruction, I think they're trying to fit this into some sort of an armed attack rationale to then justify moving forward under the UN Charter, which allows uses of force if the Security Council authorizes it, which of course we didn't have, or in situations of self-defense, where an armed attack has either happened or it's imminent and imminently happening. And of course, we don't have either of those scenarios here. So it was a breach of Venezuelan sovereignty, and they would have a claim against us if there was an international forum that could hear that. And that's where the international system and being in a much more fledgling state kind of fails us, because it isn't obvious that there's a court necessarily where these claims could be pressed.
I'm curious about something. Maduro's a really bad guy. Why indict Maduro for narcotics and not torture?
So this is something that I have struggled with, and I really would love to flip the script a little bit. So if we are going to prosecute this guy, I'm sure we have evidence of his engagement in narco trafficking, and go forth. All the best. But the Venezuelan people have suffered incredibly under Maduro, and the fact-finding mission for Venezuela has documented this in great detail. Individuals have been disappeared, there's massive arbitrary detention, and people are being held in really abject conditions. People who have been released report being mistreated and tortured. We have a torture statute that allow us to prosecute acts of torture that are committed abroad, regardless of the nationality of the perpetrator or of the victims or of the place of commission. And we have used that sparingly, most recently in a case involving a Gambian torturer that was found in Colorado, found guilty by an American jury of torture and conspiracy to commit torture. So if we're going to prosecute this guy, let's also prosecute him for torture.
Yeah, I think another case was the Chucky Taylor case,
Chucky
right?
Taylor case, exactly, the son of Charles Taylor.
So you mentioned earlier the doctrine of head of state immunity. Mm-hmm. Can Maduro use that as his defense in U.S. court?
There's no doubt that he will raise it. As I mentioned, it's very strongly embodied within U.S. law and international law. That said, the executive branch is given a fair amount of deference in terms of whether or not an individual should be entitled to be considered a head of state. And I imagine what we will argue is that he was never the legitimate head of state because, as everyone agrees, he stole the elections in 2024. And so he was illegitimate and therefore is not entitled to raise this defense. Now, it's ultimately a defense that's actually sort of owned by the country. So if Venezuela steps up and says, we consider him our legitimate, and by the way, this is a government that we've essentially left in place with Darcy Rodriguez as the acting interim president. If they step up and assert head of state immunity, I think it would be hard-pressed for a U.S. court to disagree with that. Now, the Noriega example that you mentioned is probably the best precedent we have. In that case, he also was an illegitimate leader. It was a military dictatorship. He had seized power extra-constitutionally. But my memory serves that Panama never really asserted head of state immunity on his defense. And so the executive branch came into court and said, we're prosecuting this guy and we don't think he's entitled to head of state immunity. He was, however, interestingly, given POW status, which probably Maduro would also be entitled to, which just gives him some procedural protection. It doesn't prevent him from being prosecuted.
And I suppose Venezuela itself could, if it wanted to, waive his head of state immunity.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, let me ask a final question. Why should the American public care about accountability for war crimes at home and around the world?
So I think they should care, and actually I think they do care. So I have a project that I'm updating right now at looking at polling of the American electorate and what their vision is for the United States' role in the world. And uniformly, on a bipartisan basis across the various regions, what we see is the American public saying we should be a force for good in the world. We should be promoting and protecting international human rights around the world. We should be coming in on the side of victims and doing what we can to support them and to support their aspirations for justice, democracy, etc. So I think the American people do care about this. They maybe don't quite understand the mechanisms by which the work gets done. And so I really hope that they can be proud of the legacy of the United States at Nuremberg in establishing the ad hoc international tribunals, in forming the office that used to exist, the Office of Global Criminal Justice. Those were the mechanisms by which we did this work, and that's gone now. And so I hope the American people will make their views known to their elected members of Congress.
That's a good place to close. It is time to bring our program to an end. Domestic and international war crimes are definitely an issue of growing concern to the American public. I've been speaking with Ambassador for Global Criminal Justice, Beth Van Schaack. Thank you so much, Beth, for appearing on our program and sharing your insights on this very important topic. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.